This is a story about a man who doesn't believe in this stuff. 15 years on factory nights in Leeds, a divorce, a really tough life. So when you hear what happened to Mark Ellison at St. Barrow's, understand that he actually had fought against the explanation he eventually landed on. He took the caretaker job in September. Live-in position, old boarding school in North Yorkshire, better pay than he expected, his own room, and quiet nights to himself, which is all he wanted. He made 2 mistakes the night he arrived. The first was assuming the headmistress was exaggerating when she said, "Don't bother with the East Wing." The second was thinking he'd finally found the kind of peace and quiet he'd been looking for. He heard something on his 5th night that he still can't explain, something directly above his room, in a wing that had been sealed for 50 years. No explanation ever given. But let's start at the beginning. The school appeared at the end of a narrow lane just outside Eldershaw, a grey stone fortress that had been watching over North Yorkshire since 1887. Mark pulled up in his van on a Sunday evening in September, when the light was already going dim, and the building looked like something that had grown out of the earth rather than been built on it. 3 stories of Victorian stone, iron-framed windows, a clock tower that hadn't worked since the Blitz. Parts of it had been renovated after the war, modern classrooms grafted onto the old skeleton, but you could still see where the original structure ended and the new one began, like scar tissue. Mrs. Hargreaves met him at the main entrance, a woman in her 60s, with steel grey hair and the kind of posture that suggested she'd been a headmistress for so long she'd forgotten how to stand any other way. She showed him the boiler room, the supply closets, the maintenance schedule. Then she walked him to his quarters, a small converted room on the ground floor of the East Wing, tucked beneath a stairwell that led upward into darkness. The room was fine: bed, desk, small bathroom, a window that looked out onto the grounds. Everything Mark needed. He'd worked night shifts at a factory in Leeds for 15 years. He knew how to live in small spaces. He knew how to appreciate silence. Mrs. Hargreaves handed him the keys and then paused in the doorway, one hand on the frame. She told him the top floor of the East Wing was sealed off, had been for decades. Nothing up there but empty dormitories and dry rot. Best not to bother with it, she said. Mark nodded, asked if there were structural issues he should know about. She said no, just old and unused, and the way she said it made it clear the conversation was over. Mark spent his first week learning the rhythms of the place. The school held 120 boys, ages 11 to 18, and during the day the building roared with noise. Footsteps, voices, doors slamming, the constant percussion of young life. But at night, after the students were locked in their dormitories and the staff had gone home, the place transformed into something else entirely. The corridors stretched longer in the darkness. The heating pipes ticked and groaned. Mark walked his rounds with a torch, checking windows, testing doors, and for the first few nights he felt something close to contentment. This was exactly what he'd wanted when he'd left the factory, left the divorce, left Leeds. Space, solitude, a job where nobody needed anything from him except to keep the building standing. On his 5th night he heard the footsteps. It was just past 2 in the morning, and Mark was lying in bed reading when he heard them directly above his room. Slow, measured footsteps, like someone pacing back and forth across a wooden floor. He stopped reading and listened. The footsteps continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Mark waited. Nothing. He checked the building plans he'd been given. Above his room was the sealed East Wing, the abandoned dormitories, the floor that nobody used. He went back to his book and convinced himself it was pipes expanding, or the wind, or the old building settling. Schools this age made noise, That's what old buildings did. But the next night, the footsteps came again. Same time, same deliberate pace. Back and forth, like someone walking the length of a room and then turning around. Mark lay there in the dark and counted the steps. 12 paces one direction. Pause. 12 paces back. Over and over for nearly 3 minutes before they stopped. The following afternoon, Mark mentioned it to Tom Ridley, the maintenance worker who came twice a week to handle repairs. Tom was a local lad, 28, friendly in that cautious Yorkshire way. Mark asked him casually if there were ever issues with the East Wing, with animals getting in maybe, squirrels or birds. Tom stopped what he was doing, a wrench halfway to a radiator valve, and looked at Mark with something that might have been concern or might have been amusement. Tom said the place was empty, had been since the 70s, said it in a way that suggested Mark shouldn't ask follow-up questions. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that it was best not to go up there. When Mark asked why, Tom just shrugged and said some parts of old buildings were better left alone, and went back to his radiator. That night, the footsteps returned, but this time they were different. Not just pacing now, but purposeful, like someone walking from one end of the room to the other and then stopping at specific points. And then, around 3 in the morning, Mark heard what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor above him. A heavy scraping sound, wood on wood, something being pulled slowly from one side of the room to the other. Mark got out of bed, stood in the middle of his room, and stared at the ceiling. The scraping continued for maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. Then the footsteps again, that same measured pace, 12 steps in each direction. In the morning, Mark found a fine coating of gray dust on his desk. He looked up. There, in the plaster of the ceiling, was a hairline crack he hadn't noticed before. Something was moving up there, something heavy enough to disturb 60-year-old plaster. He set his phone to record that night before he went to sleep, propped it on the desk facing upward, audio on maximum sensitivity. When he played it back the next morning, he heard his own breathing, the distant tick of the heating system, just, normal building sounds. Then, at 2:17 a.m., the footsteps began. They were clear on the recording, unmistakable. 12 paces, pause, 12 paces back. Then something else, a sound that made Mark's stomach tighten, the creak of a door opening, long and slow, like someone was being very careful not to make noise. Then silence. Mark took the recording to Mrs. Hargreaves. She listened to 30 seconds of it, handed him back his phone and told him old buildings made all kinds of sounds, that the East Wing's floorboards probably contracted at night, that he'd get used to it. Her face didn't change when she said it, but Mark noticed she wouldn't meet his eyes. He tried a different approach. He asked the school secretary, a woman in her 40s named Patricia, who'd worked there for 20 years, if she knew anything about the East Wing's history. Patricia glanced toward Mrs. Hargreaves' office, then lowered her voice and told him something that made the footsteps suddenly feel less abstract. In 1973, a student had died up there. 15-year-old boy, disciplinary case, had been confined to one of the dormitory rooms as punishment for fighting. Back then, they still did that. Locked troublesome students in empty rooms overnight to think about what they'd done. The boy had somehow gotten out onto the balcony and fallen, or jumped. The official report said accidental death, but Patricia had heard from older staff members that there were questions about why the door had been locked from the outside, why nobody had checked on him for 8 hours, why the balcony railing had been damaged before he went over. The wing was closed immediately after, never reopened. The school said it was due to budget constraints, but Patricia thought it was because nobody wanted to use those rooms anymore. Nobody wanted to sleep where a child had died alone and frightened in the dark. That night, Mark lay in bed and listened to the footsteps with new understanding. They started at 2:15 a.m., right on schedule. But this time he tracked them differently. 12 paces. That would be the length of a dormitory room. Pause. Standing at the window maybe, or the door. 12 paces back, pacing, like someone trapped and desperate. The pattern wasn't random. It was the pattern of someone confined, someone walking the only space available to them, over and over and over. The footsteps stopped directly above Mark's bed. He could hear them clearly, could almost feel them through the ceiling. And then they did something they'd never done before. They moved. Not pacing now, but walking in a straight line from the center of the room toward what Mark realized must be the door. The footsteps approached the sealed entrance to the wing, and then nothing. Complete silence. Mark lay there in the dark, barely breathing, and then he heard it. So faint he almost missed it. The sound of someone trying a door handle, slowly, carefully, testing to see if it would turn. Once, twice, 3 times. Then the footsteps retreated back across the room and resumed their pacing. By the end of the second week, Mark wasn't sleeping properly. The footsteps came every night now, always the same pattern, always ending with that terrible moment when something walked to the door and tried the handle. He'd started leaving his light on, started sleeping with headphones playing music, anything to drown out the sounds from above. But he could feel them anyway, could feel the presence of whatever was up there, pacing and pacing in a room that had been empty for 52 years. He decided to go up there, not to investigate properly, not to confront anything, just to prove to himself that it was nothing, that there was a rational explanation. Pipes, wind, the building settling, anything but what his mind was starting to suspect. The back stairwell that led to the east wing's top floor was behind a door marked "Staff Only" near the library. Mark went up during his afternoon break, before his night shift started, when the building was full of people and daylight still came through the windows. The stairs were steep and narrow, Victorian iron steps that rang under his feet. At the top was a landing and a heavy fire door with a bolt and padlock, all of it covered in dust. Mark stood there for a long moment, looking at that door. The padlock was old, but secure. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. Nobody had been through here in years, decades maybe. And yet, as he stood there, he heard something that made his hands start to shake. From the other side of that sealed door, from somewhere in the abandoned corridor beyond, came the sound of breathing. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, rhythmic breathing, like someone standing on the other side waiting for him. Mark backed away. He turned and went down those stairs faster than he'd come up, and he didn't stop until he was back in the main building, surrounded by the noise of students and staff and normal life. His hands were shaking so badly he had to sit in the staff room for 20 minutes before he could go back to work. That evening, he called maintenance. He told them there might be an animal trapped in the east wing and asked if someone could check. 2 men came the next day, Tom Ridley and an older contractor. They went up with a key to the padlock, spent about 40 minutes up there, and came back down looking puzzled. No animals, no signs of entry, no droppings, no nests, no damage to the windows. Everything was sealed up tight, exactly as it should be. But Tom pulled Mark aside before he left and told him something strange. The dust on the corridor floor, the dust that should have been undisturbed for decades, had footprints in it, fresh ones, small feet, like a child or a slight teenager. The prints went from one of the old dormitory doors to the middle of the corridor and then just stopped, as if whoever made them had been walking and then suddenly stood still, listening. The prints didn't lead anywhere else. No prints going to the windows, no prints going to the stairs. Just that one path, ending in the middle of the hallway, pointing toward the sealed fire door, pointing down toward where Mark slept. Mark gave his notice the next day. He told Mrs. Hargreaves it wasn't working out. family reasons, needed to return to Leeds. She accepted his resignation without question, almost as if she'd been expecting it. She asked if he'd be willing to stay until they found a replacement. Mark said he'd stay 1 more week, not a day longer. During that final week, the footsteps changed again. Now they came earlier, starting at midnight instead of 2 in the morning. And they were faster, more agitated, not pacing anymore, but walking quickly, back and forth, like someone growing increasingly distressed. The sound of the door handle being tried became more insistent. Once, Mark heard what sounded like someone pushing against the door, a rhythmic thumping that went on for almost a minute before it stopped. On his last night, Mark lay in bed fully dressed, packed bags by the door, waiting for dawn. The footsteps started at 11 p.m. Frantic now, almost running, back and forth, and then that sound again, the door handle, but this time accompanied by something that made Mark's blood freeze. Scratching. Long, desperate scratching, like fingernails dragging down wood, and underneath it, so faint he almost didn't hear it, a sound that might have been crying. Mark left at first light, didn't even say goodbye, just got in his van and drove back to Leeds. He didn't tell anyone what he'd heard that last night. He tried not to think about the footprints Tom had found, tried not to imagine a 15-year-old boy locked in a room for 8 hours, pacing and crying and trying the door over and over until something terrible happened. 6 months later, Mark got a call from Tom Ridley. They'd hired a new caretaker, Tom told him. Nice bloke, ex-military, seemed solid. He'd lasted 3 weeks. Same room, same complaints. Said something was walking above him at night. Said he'd heard someone crying. The headmistress had given him the same speech about old buildings and settling wood, and he'd left anyway, just like Mark. Tom asked Mark directly then if he'd heard things up there, if that's really why he'd left. Mark said yes. Tom went quiet for a moment, then told him something Mark wished he'd known from the start. Every caretaker who'd lived in that room since 1973 had reported the same thing. Footsteps, pacing, the sound of someone trying to get out. Most lasted a month or 2. Some made it longer. None of them stayed permanently. The school stopped advertising it as live-in after a while, made it a day position instead. But every few years they'd try again with someone new. The room was convenient. The salary was better if you lived on site, and there was always someone desperate enough for work or solitude to take it. Tom said he'd pulled the old records once, out of curiosity. Since 1973, there had been 14 caretakers assigned to that room. The longest anyone had lasted was 4 months. The average was 6 weeks. They all described the same sound, pacing, slow and steady, above the room in the wing that had been empty for over 50 years. Mark asked Tom what he thought it was. Tom didn't answer directly. He just said that some places remember what happened in them, that buildings hold on to things, especially the violent things, especially the frightened things. He said the boy who died up there was named Christopher Marsh, that he'd been locked in for fighting with another student, that the punishment was meant to last 1 night, but somehow the supervising teacher forgot to let him out until morning. By the time they unlocked the door, Christopher was gone. The balcony door was open. The railing was broken. The official report said he must have panicked, tried to escape, fallen in the dark. But Tom had talked to people who'd been students then, and they remembered it differently. They remembered Christopher shouting for hours that first night. Remembered him banging on the door, begging to be let out. Remembered how the sound had stopped suddenly around 3 in the morning, and how nobody had gone to check on him, even though the silence was somehow worse than the shouting had been. Mark thanked Tom for calling and hung up. He thought about those footprints in the dust, stopping in the middle of the corridor, thought about the pattern of the pacing, 12 steps. Pause. 12 steps back. The exact dimensions of a locked room. Thought about that sound of breathing on the other side of the fire door, and the scratching, and the crying. He thought about Christopher Marsh, 15 years old, locked in a room as punishment, waiting for someone to open the door. Still waiting, apparently. Still pacing that same space, still trying the door handle, still hoping that this time someone would hear him and let him out. Mark never went back to St. Barrow's, but sometimes late at night in his flat in Leeds, he wakes up and thinks he hears it. That patient, measured pacing. 12 steps forward. Pause. 12 steps back. The sound of someone who's been walking the same path for so long, they've forgotten there was ever any other way to move. The school still stands on the outskirts of Eldershaw. The east wing is still sealed. The room beneath it is still marked as staff quarters on the building plans, though these days they don't mention it to new hires unless someone specifically asks. And every few years, someone does ask. Someone who needs the job, who likes the quiet, who thinks they can handle whatever an old building might throw at them. They never last long, because some things that get locked away don't stop trying to get out. They just keep pacing and knocking, and waiting for someone to finally open the door and let them leave the place where they died, frightened and alone, calling for help that never came. We've reached the end of the night's patrol. You can turn off your light now, but before you do, listen closely to the quiet. You know you'll be back here with us again. You'll be back to hear what's still waiting. And please, remember to lock your door before you try to sleep. We'll be waiting for you next week, right here, same time at 3 a.m. Until then, try not to listen too closely to the ceiling. Good night, and stay safe if you can.